So as Darwin studied comparative anatomy, he came upon some puzzles, some features of creatures that didn't seem to have any useful purpose, right? Parts without purpose would be a challenge to the idea of intelligent design. We'll come to call these structures vestigial, and you'll see why in a moment. First, let's take a look at some examples of these parts without purpose. Molars. The third molars here, the wisdom teeth. Sometimes they don't even erupt. They don't even come in. They might be impacted, so they never sort of take their place in your mouth to do any food processing. Nevertheless, we might have them, and they can easily be removed without any negative effect. So it's as if this is a part that we sort of don't need. Muscles to the outer ear, not critical for human survival. We've got a tailbone, right, at the end of our spine, and yet we don't have a tail. It's sort of odd. And then we've got the appendix. It doesn't seem to do anything for us today, and in fact, it is often removed if it gets infected. So here we've got some parts that don't seem to have a lot of purpose. Now, Darwin is going to have an explanation for the existence of these characteristics. Whereas for Paley, it's a little bit of a puzzle. Why would God design humans with these parts that don't seem to have any important purpose? Darwin's going to say they don't have a function today, but they did in the ancestral species, right? And it's just that over time, as natural selection operated over thousands of generations, some of these features have lost their function. So selection was not maintaining them, and so they can sort of deteriorate, or they can come to have no function in the current species. So we're going to define a vestigial structure here as a structure that functioned in the ancestor but lost function in the current species. Now let's consider birds as an example. Now, birds have hollow bones. Now, this makes sense. That's an adaptation for flight, hollow bones. They are lighter, right? So birds that fly have hollow bones, and we would understand, okay, natural selection would favor a skeleton that was lighter if flight was an important capacity, right? So, but here's the puzzle. This bird is a penguin, right? And the penguin also has hollow bones. Now, penguins don't fly, right? Yet they have the hollow bones. So the hollow bones doesn't appear to be an adaptation for the penguin's mode of life. And Darwin's going to argue that what we're looking at here is a vestigial characteristic. The hollow bones were present in the ancestors of penguins, who were birds that flew, but in the evolution of penguins, as they lost their flight, they did not lose the hollow bones. So that is a sort of a holdover, a leftover characteristic from the ancestral species. So for penguins, hollow bones would be a vestigial structure. And here we have the Galapagos Cormorant. So the cormorant has wings, but these wings cannot power flight. So it's a bird with wings, but the bird can't fly. Now, how do these cormorants make their living on the Galapagos Islands? Well, they don't fly, but they do swim. So they dive into the ocean, and they catch fish and octopus and other types of things. So in fact, under those circumstances, it might even be an advantage to have smaller wings if you're a swimmer, so you can tuck them closer to your body and there'd be less drag in the water. Now again, how would natural selection produce this state of affairs? Well, when the cormorants colonized the islands, and remember they would be cormorants that could fly, they colonized the islands. Over time, as David Hume would say, and Darwin would agree, nature will be experimenting with the wings of the offspring. And sometimes that experiment might be a reduction in the wing size or capability. Well, if there are no predators on the island, there's no penalty for that reduction in wing size or capability. So that variation can survive just as well as an offspring that had the original parental wings. In fact, the offspring with smaller wings, as we said, might actually have an advantage because they might be better swimmers. So the idea here is that the cormorant that was able to fly, colonized from South America, colonized the islands. Of course, there are still South American cormorants, but here we see the branch in the evolutionary tree. Some individual cormorants made it out to the Galapagos Islands, and in a situation where there are no predators, natural selection will not be favoring functional wings if they're not contributing right to the survival. If they're not giving you any kind of advantage, natural selection is not going to be favoring that characteristic. In fact, experiments or variations in wing size here, smaller wings, might have the advantage. And so over evolutionary time, then, the cormorant has lost the ability to fly. So the wings themselves, though, we would call them vestigial. They were functional in the ancestor, but non-functional in the current species. Darwin has a natural explanation for the existence of these vestigial structures. Remember, David Hume posed this type of observation, this type of creature, as a challenge to Paley's design argument. If God were designing species, why would God make birds with wings that didn't work? David Hume took that to weaken the design argument. Darwin now is going to come along with a natural explanation for the existence of these wings that don't work. And if we get inside the wing, we can actually see some of the skeletal differences. Here is a cormorant that does fly. It's got a large breastbone. It's got a keel. This ridge on the breastbone here is where flight muscles attach, so the powerful chest muscles. Large wing bones. This is a powerful flying bird. And if we compare that to the Galapagos species, notice the wing bones are smaller, and there's no keel for the attachment of chest muscles. So the number of chest muscles is much reduced here. So these birds are just not equipped for flight. Let's take a look at one more example. Here we have a blind cave fish. Right? So this fish cannot see. It lives in dark caves underwater. Yet it does have some eye parts. And we would call these then vestigial eye parts, with the understanding that the ancestors of these fish did have functional eyes. So we can model this with our tree diagram. We have a seeing fish ancestor, a fish ancestor with functioning eyes that was living in waters where there would be light, so vision would be useful and adaptive. And then some of those individuals migrate to the cave environment and are able to make a living there. But of course, in the dark environment, eyes don't give you an advantage anymore, right? So here we see the branching off to the evolution of the blind cave fish. And again, just like the cormorant, there's no penalty then. When you're in a darkened cave, there's no penalty for any variations that make your eyes non-functional. In fact, there may be advantages to not developing eyes, namely that eyes can get infected, for example. And so if you don't have eyes, you may be at less risk for infection. So again, we see some individuals of the ancestral species stayed up in the waters where there was light and seeing was an advantage, but some migrated into a new environment, new way of life, making a living in the dark caves. And here now, then, the selection pressures are going to change. There's no longer a selection pressure for vision, right? So any experiments or any variations that negatively impact the eyes, there will be no penalty for that. And in fact, there might be an advantage. In the case of the cormorant and the blind cavefish, then, again, the challenge to Paley's worldview is that why would God be making the fish with some eye parts, but that just didn't work, right? It didn't have a fully functioning eye, but it still had some eye parts. That wouldn't seem to fit with the idea of intelligent design. So we have the case of the blind cavefish, we have the case of the cormorants, we have the penguins with the hollow bones, we have humans with a variety of structures. All we call vestigial structures. They had function in the ancestral species, but that function was lost in the current species.